It probably starts with a little history. The playbook for 2018 or 2017 was really based on kind of the SEC's statements to us privately and to the world publicly that there would really be no rulemaking, no action letters, no public rules of the road. That it was simply facts and circumstances, case by case, based on the Howey test, ask a lawyer. That's what you were hearing from the SEC in 2017. And I think a lot of teams made decisions based on that idea and based on simply having to kind of figure out the very best approach given the fact that there would be no kind of formal guidance from the SEC in this area. That led to what we all experienced, which was pretty much a free-for-all where a lot of teams went out and just took their best shot at trying to be as compliant as they could possibly be. And I think one of the interesting facts that happened was a lot of the law firms pulled back and frankly were not willing to kind of wade in and give advice. And so the gatekeepers kind of were absent in a lot of that process. What happened sort of in the January-ish timeframe, you guys probably all saw Jay Clayton, who's the chairman of the SEC, make a lot of noise about the fact that there was the gatekeepers were not doing their job, that there was all this fraud in the market, and he was probably doing that as a response to Joe Grunfest's op-ed piece in I can't remember if it was the Times or the Journal, but Grunfest is a professor at Stanford, himself a former SEC commissioner, so when he called out the SEC for not enforcing it, I'm sure Jay took it to heart. So Jay went on the warpath, did these scathing speeches and calling out the industry and everybody. So, but he then, after talking to Grunfest in a fireside chat at the Stanford campus, made his way over to see Andreessen the next morning. And this is the part that now not a lot of people know. And he invited Chris Dixon to round up the sort of the industry players who were really kind of trying to do it the right way, and asked for a couple of things. One, essentially, lay out in a very detailed, written, footnoted memo what existing law says about utility tokens. And two, give us a proposal for where to go from here. And so Andreessen, I've been representing Andreessen in all of their crypto investments since the beginning, and so I got the chance to be the one to write all that stuff. So and I pulled in Cooley and I pulled in a couple of law firms, so we've now got a nice little working group of law firms that are in the space that are doing this. The general reception I think we got when we visited the SEC back in April was actually really positive, and it was an interesting dichotomy between their public-facing sort of incredibly vituperative statements that they were making and this interesting sort of welcome that we got privately, and so I think they're hungry for some help and some industry players to really kind of leverage. They're underfunded and everything else. And so I think they're looking for industry to help solve this problem, and hopefully that is what is happening now. So the real reason I tell you this story is because it affects our playbook for 2018. And so while 2017 there were not going to be any rules of the road, coming soon, and we've got our next meeting set up in October. So I'll know a whole lot more about it, what the SEC thinks currently, after that. But right now, I think my expectation is we're still going to get this no action letter published within the next, call it 3 or 4 or 5 months. And the consequence of that fact, to me, hindsight being 2020, is that the last thing you would want to be doing right now is trying to go out with a splashy ICO that takes the position it's not a security without following any of these rules of the road that are about to be published. So what we are basically telling people to do is raise money through a pre-sale as a security. Now, one of the really great things about the interaction so far, one of the battles we've won is around this concept of mutability. And I guess I would say I'm pretty confident we've won this battle, but there are still skirmishes happening on the border with some of the staff at the SEC around exactly what mutability means and the exact consequences of it. In general, what I mean by mutability is that we're dealing with an investment contract, not a typical equity or debt security. Equity and debt are non-mutable securities. They're securities inherently by nature of the fact that there is a centralized issuer who's, in the case of equity, whose financial position is, you're buying a share of that financial position, and that you're dependent on that centralized issuer for your returns as a shareholder of that company. Debt is similar. You're depending on some corporate entity to be solvent and to pay you your interest on that debt security. In the context of utility tokens that offer no native financial return, and where the only type of financial return at stake is secondary market appreciation, you have this very interesting fact that the investment contract analysis under Howey is based on facts and circumstances, which change over time. And because the only financial return is secondary market trading, there's an opportunity for all these other facts and circumstances to shift enough so that even if the offer and sale initially was treated like a investment contract, at some point later, an offer and sale of that exact same token could be a non-security. And so that's what I mean by mutability, is that at one point the offer and sale is a security and later it's not. Where the tipping point is, where the sort of, the exact nature of the facts and circumstances that need to change are really what's at stake in this no action letter. And so we're sort of defining it. But in general, I think of it as sort of, two different things. One is sort of full decentralization, and that's what the Hinman speech, which tracks my memo pretty well, has come out and said. And the Hinman speech has generally said, okay, decentralization, we think, gets both Bitcoin and Ether out of securities law status. And sort of the way I positioned it in the memo was, that's kind of like a bookend. That's like an easy case. Like if it's fully decentralized, there's no real issuer, so it's relatively easy to test for a fully decentralized token. The harder part is full functionality, and that's where I think a lot of people have been focused over the last few years is, there's a general theme out there that, once you've built your token and it's fully functional, now it should be a product. Now it should be a non-security. It should be able to be traded. And I agree with that generally. The problem I think we have with full functionality as the transition point is that we're talking about software. We're talking about software networks in particular. That, as we all know, every piece of software has updates and upgrades that just happen constantly. And so it's pretty hard to take the position that a piece of software is ever truly fully functional, right? It's never frozen. So we have to figure out from an analytical point of view, really at what point, based on all the case law that that's in this area, at what point do the efforts of others really fall away as the basis for the person's expectation of profits? And when you start to think about that, it really is the case that there's so many other exogenous variables relating to a person's expectation of profits when they're trading tokens in a secondary market, that once you get to full functionality, there should really be a case to be made that all those exogenous variables take over as the primary driver of a person's expectation of profits. But because of these updates and upgrades, we're probably going to create some additional, call it investor protections, or maybe the better thing to say is more factors that indicate a consumptive intent to layer in as part of the constellation of facts, so that full functionality, plus these other facts will get you to a non-security status. But that's the TBD part, is exactly full functionality plus what is the question. And so we're working on that. But it'll probably be some version, some combination of a lockup, maybe it's just a resale lockup so that the person could use the token in the network for its intended purpose from day one, but they just can't resell it on Bittrex. And probably some kind of volume limitations maybe, but those are the kinds of things that are being kicked around at the moment in terms of trying to essentially layer in some additional good facts to this constellation of facts that you'd say make it a non-security. So in general, our playbook again for this year is it's okay to raise the money in a pre-sale, which what I mean is you don't deliver the tokens. You've probably heard about the SAFT, or we use something called a safe T as our pre-sale agreement. But in general, what you're doing is selling tokens in the future. You're collecting money today. You're not minting the tokens. You're agreeing to essentially use the money to go build full functionality, and then you'll mint the tokens in the future. You got a question? Yeah.
Two questions.
Sure.
One is, you mentioned something about a no action letter.
Yeah.
Maybe you can, I missed the part, is that something in the works in the next 3 or 4 months? And then two is functionality. Let's say your token has, say, 100 million in circulation, and there are users who are buying it purely for usage and not speculation.
Yeah.
But maybe those users bought maybe only 1 million or 2 million. And so there's functionality, but adoption is low. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Good questions. So, yes, the no action letter is in the works. It's going to define the rules of the road for how to do a token sale kind of going forward. And the, timing wise, I've been sort of saying 3, 4, 5, 6 months, something like that. Actually, for a long time, I've been saying this year. And now I'm getting worried because we're getting close to the holidays. But we'll see if we get it done this year. I'm hopeful that we can. In terms of, how do you figure out? I do have another presentation coming up here at this conference about what does full decentralization mean. But to give you the sneak peek, I mean, in general, I think what you're really talking about is trying to kill the efforts of others prong of the Howey test. And so you're looking for indications that through the governance of the token or through the governance of the network, depending on which is the kind of important thing, and that depends on what type of token it is, if it's a protocol token or if it's an app token. It's the driver of value, whichever it is, whether it's, in Bitcoin's case, it's such a general purpose currency, you can't really point to any particular apps. People would look at the decentralization of the token, the blockchain governance to decide whether or not sort of Bitcoin is fully decentralized in this. And what's really meant by that is who controls the updates and upgrades, who controls the new features to be added to this thing. Because that's really the core of Howey, is that I've sold you something and created an expectation in my transaction with you, whereby you're now expecting to profit based on my efforts, right? And that's the fundamental touchstone of Howey, is creating an expectation of profits that is based on the efforts of others. And so if I'm selling you, a token that isn't quite done yet, and there's a lot of features that need to be built, and I'm promising a whole bunch of features, and especially when I've got a whole roadmap full of future features, that's a pretty dangerous place from a securities law standpoint, because it sure looks like I'm going to go build something that you're then going to value based on my efforts to continue building it. So it's all about those future features, who controls them, how decentralized is the control over those features? Is it a broad open source community that's building the features, or is it one team, however we define it, in a corporation, you know, a partnership, a loose affiliation of groups. And this is where I think there's a lot of interesting places that we're going to go eventually with the definition of decentralization is sort of how do we really define who the issuer is for that purpose. And you could make a lot of cases even with Ethereum as a good example, where Bill has come out and said Ethereum's not currently, and here's the right way to say it. It's not about the token. The token is never a security. None of these tokens are ever securities. But don't think that gets you anywhere, because it's really the transaction that matters. And so the way, if you read Bill's speech, it carefully goes through and very carefully says thus the offer and sale of the token, of Bitcoin and of Ether today does not constitute the offer and sale of a security. In other words, there's no investment contract formed because there's no, one person selling Bitcoin to another is not creating an expectation of profits on some issuer's efforts. So, so the current secondary trading is not a securities violation, is really what he's saying. But that he left open, you know, even in Bitcoin's case, whether maybe the original primary offering might have been a securities law violation. So anyway, so in your case, you know, figuring out where you've got some users using and some users reselling, some buyers reselling. I think as a very practical matter, the 2017 vintage and 2018 vintage who went out before this no action letter gets published are probably going to have to rely on full decentralization as the tipping point, as the trigger. And you're going to have to get yourself to the same point as Bitcoin and Ether in order to be considered at that point then no longer a security. And that's going to depend on, and again, go ahead.
Yeah, one quick follow-up. That no action letter, it sounds like it will apply as guidance for ICOs going forward. What about everything that's happened in the past? Do you think they'll have some kind of public statement about everything that's happened in the past, or will those kind of be more kind of one-on-one resolutions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think anything's going to be resolved. That is really the hot button item, you know, in terms of how to resolve what's gone on in the past. You know, I'm sort of hopeful that what this indicates to everybody is that by pivoting from no rules to rules means that the SEC has decided, hopefully, to focus its enforcement efforts rather than on a rulemaking process. I mean, you can imagine, and what we were worried about, frankly, in 2017 was that by saying we're not going to do rules, implicit was we're going to create rules through enforcement, and that would require them to enforce all the way up the chain, you know, from the most obvious fraud to the least obvious fraud, in order to create all the rules in the middle. And so, what I am hopeful of is that this pivot at least may be an indication that they're going to focus on targeted strikes on the fraud, obvious frauds, and use the rules as the way to create, the go forward kind of guideposts. So that won't help with hindsight's 2020. Even if you think the SEC, even if we all in this room feel comfortable that the SEC won't bring it, third parties won't. Third parties are going to still, your banks, your potential buyers, your potential funding sources, they're all going to give you a hard time in due diligence, you know, because this kind of securities law violation is a huge contingent liability for potential rescission offers that third parties are going to really focus on. So I do have to figure out what to do with 2017 vintage, 2018 vintage in terms of coming up with some kind of a solution for them to get out of this really difficult position. But I can imagine the SEC not having too much sympathy. So we'll see if we can get anything out of them. Any other questions?
So is there any update on legal cases that are going through the courts,
Yeah.
civil cases,
Yeah.
in terms of how the courts might define the interpretation
Yes.
of past actions?
I mean, nothing definitive yet, but it's an important point, and there's a couple of things. So in addition to hindsight's 2020 and third parties are going to give you a hard time, one of the things that we are starting to actually see, I think we tracked 40 or 45 cases filed in the last month or two by private plaintiffs, and that's not the SEC bringing enforcement action. So even if, again, the SEC is laying off, we're starting to see private plaintiffs bring these cases, and we're starting to see some of the states. Massachusetts has brought up you, and some of the other state regulators are bringing them under state law. Private plaintiffs are bringing them under federal law in many cases, and so we will see a lot of these cases. So you are going to have to face some kind of defense. I think the 2017-2018 vintage is probably going to have to face some defense of some of these token sales that have gone on.
Like, for example, the Ripple case was a pretty well-publicized one.
True.
Has that progressed at all, and is there any?
No, it's still very preliminary. Yeah, nothing to be drawn, no conclusions to be drawn yet. I think I'm hopeful that it is one of the reasons that, or it gives me hope that the SEC will act more quickly, because I think one of the reasons for them to act is to avoid ceding control over the policy making to the courts. And I think the courts are going to really probably take a very analytical approach to this area and not so much a policy approach. And so I think in order to get out in front of some of this stuff, I think the SEC does need, now's the time for the SEC to really get in and have some rules out there that are based on good policy. So we'll see. But so I think I was talking about kind of the general playbook, and I think so raising money through a pre-sale to accredited investors without delivering the token. That's a really important idea, because the token itself, you just can't control these things. Once they're in people's hands, they can be sold peer-to-peer. They can wind up on exchanges, and you can be in the soup, regardless of how you did it. So the general playbook is to do the pre-sale, don't deliver the tokens, and simply wait for this SEC process to unfold. Our form of pre-sale agreement leaves a lot of flexibility to impose additional lockups, impose additional terms to the extent necessary to satisfy this SEC guidelines that are coming out, so that you can raise the money now, have the flexibility to impose what you need to impose in order to deliver the token as a non-security to those investors at the appropriate moment with the right guardrails in place. And that's, to me, that's the way I would do it if I'm raising money through token sales today. So that's really the playbook. Thanks, guys.